Claire drove for hours through winding Vermont roads, the radio low and the windows cracked just enough to let in the cool pine-scented air. She hadn't planned to go this far north. She hadn't planned much of anything, really. 2 weeks earlier, she had been sitting in her Boston apartment, surrounded by unopened wedding gifts and a silence that felt louder than any argument. The engagement was over, and so was the life she thought she was building. Her best friend Madison had practically packed her suitcase for her. "Go," she'd said. "Find quiet. Find yourself." And so Claire drove until the city noise disappeared in her rearview mirror. When she reached the farmhouse at Maple Hill, the sun was already dipping behind the trees, spreading long shadows over the fields. The cottage stood behind a red barn, small and charming, with white shutters and a porch swing that moved gently in the wind. It looked like a painting too peaceful to still. She parked, stepped out, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under her boots. For the first time in months, no one expected anything from her. She breathed out, slow and shaky, and whispered to herself, "This will do." Mrs. Harrison, the owner, appeared from the barn carrying a metal bucket and wearing a smile that warmed the air. She was the kind of woman who seemed to belong to the land hands worn, eyes kind, movements steady. "You must be Claire," she said. "Welcome. My husband's out feeding the calves. But come in, dear. You must be tired." Inside the farmhouse smelled of fresh bread and wood smoke. Mrs. Harrison poured her a glass of milk fresh, cold and white as the morning frost. "From our cows," she said proudly. "You'll taste the difference." Claire took a hesitant sip. It was smooth and pure, sweeter than she expected. Something about it felt grounding, like it belonged to this place, and now, somehow, so did she. She smiled politely, thanked her host, and carried her bags to the guest house. The cottage was small but cozy, one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a window that looked out across endless green hills. She unpacked slowly, trying to fill the empty space with purpose. Her paints and sketchbook went on the table by the window, her notebook and camera beside them. She had promised herself she'd paint again, write again, remember what silence sounded like. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The quiet was too deep. She was used to sirens, streetlights, and city hums. Here, she could hear the house breathing, the wood creaking, the wind brushing the shutters, the soft low of cows in the distance. She turned on her side and stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying every word from the last fight, every look of disappointment she had received. The ring box still sat unopened in her suitcase. She didn't know why she brought it. Maybe to remind herself that she hadn't imagined everything. Morning came with light spilling across her pillow and the smell of grass heavy in the air. Claire walked to the porch with her coffee and saw the Harrisons already working in the fields. She watched as the older man guided a group of cows down a path, moving slowly but with a rhythm that spoke of years spent in the same dance. Mrs. Harrison waved at her from afar, and Claire, still half asleep, waved back. Later that morning, she went to the barn to ask if she could explore the property. Mrs. Harrison nodded eagerly. "Of course, dear. You'll find peace in those hills. But stay away from the north pasture until Ethan's done fixing the fence." Claire didn't know who Ethan was, and she didn't ask. The name stayed in her mind, though, lingering like a tune she couldn't place. The air outside smelled clean, sharp with morning dew. She walked through the open fields, her shoes damp from the grass, her thoughts wandering. The land rolled in soft hills, dotted with wildflowers and patches of golden sunlight. Every corner felt untouched, honest. She stopped near a wooden gate, resting her hands on the top rail, watching the cows graze lazily. For a moment, she felt still, really still. By noon, the sun grew stronger, and she returned to the cottage to paint. Her brush moved without much thought, just colors and shapes, shades of green and gold. She hadn't painted in over a year, not since her gallery work had started to feel like another job. But now it came back quietly, like a song she'd forgotten she knew. She worked until she realized the shadows had grown long again. A soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Mr. Harrison holding 2 bottles of milk. "Thought you might like some for the morning," he said. His voice was rough but gentle. "My wife says city folks forget what real milk tastes like." Claire smiled. She's right. It's different. He nodded. That's because it's alive. Nothing here's rushed. Then he tipped his hat and left her standing there thinking about that word alive. That night, she sat on the porch with one of the bottles. The glass was cool against her fingers. She took a sip and watched the sky turn from blue to purple. Fireflies began to appear, blinking softly around the porch steps. It felt like the world had slowed just for her. Still, underneath the calm, something stirred an ache she didn't know how to name. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was hope. She had come here to be alone, but already she felt like the place itself was speaking to her, whispering that healing doesn't come in silence alone. It comes when you start to listen again to wind, to laughter, to your own heartbeat. In the distance, she heard a low voice, a man's laughing faintly. It came from near the barn. She saw a figure moving there, tall, with a calm kind of strength in the way he walked. She couldn't see his face, just the way the lantern light fell across his shoulders. And though it was only a glimpse, it felt like something inside her shifted slightly, as if life had taken a quiet breath before something new began. When she went to bed that night, she left the window open. The air drifted in soft, cool, filled with the scent of grass and something faintly sweet like fresh hay. For the first time in a long while, she slept deeply. The next morning, Mrs. Harrison knocked again, holding another bottle of milk, smiling warmly. "Our cows worked hard for this one," she said. Claire thanked her, smiling back, feeling a strange fondness for this daily ritual. She took a sip, the milk still cold from the barn. It tasted of something she couldn't quite describe, something honest and pure. As she stood there, looking out over the hills, she realized the stillness didn't scare her anymore. It welcomed her. The pain she had carried from the city was still there, but softer now, wrapped in the sounds of the farm and the gentle rhythm of days that didn't rush. She didn't know that soon she'd learn the name of the man who laughed in the barn. She didn't know that this quiet place would hold the story that would change her life. For now, there was only the cottage, the hills, and the milk she drank every morning, the taste of peace, and the beginning of something she wasn't ready to name. The morning was cool. The sky brushed with thin clouds that promised another clear day. Claire had grown used to the rhythm of the farm, the soft sounds of cows, the creak of the barn doors, the steady heartbeat of country life. Each sunrise felt cleaner than the last, washing away a little more of the noise she'd carried from the city. But that morning, something new caught her attention. A voice, deep, low, and patient. Coming from behind the barn, she followed it and found a man crouched near a broken fence, hammer in hand. He wore faded jeans, boots covered in mud, and a plain gray shirt rolled at the sleeves. His dark hair was messy and the sun caught the edge of his jawline as he worked. When he noticed her standing there, he paused, straightened, and gave a small nod. "Morning," he said simply. She hesitated, brushing her hair from her face. "Hi, I'm renting the cottage," she replied, trying not to sound too curious. "I know," he said with a small smile. "Mrs. Harrison told me. I'm Ethan." The name matched the voice she'd heard the night before. It was calm, unhurried, and strangely familiar. He turned back to his work, and for a moment she just watched him. There was something about the way he moved, steady, sure, quiet confidence in every motion. She wasn't sure why that made her heart beat faster. Trying to fill the silence, she said, "You start early." He shrugged lightly. "Cows don't wait." Then, without looking up, he added, "You're the painter, right?" "Mrs. Harrison said you came to rest." "Something like that," Claire said, feeling a little embarrassed. "I'm just trying to remember how to breathe." That made him glance at her, his expression thoughtful. "This place helps," he said softly. "It slows you down until you have no choice but to listen to yourself again." She nodded, unsure how to respond. There was something about the way he said things, plain words, that carried weight. Over the next few days, their paths crossed more often. She would find him fixing fences, carrying hay, or washing tools by the barn. Sometimes he'd wave. Sometimes they'd talk for a minute or two. The conversations were never long, but they stayed with her. Ethan wasn't like anyone she'd known in the city. He didn't rush to fill silence or try to impress her. He just existed easily, like part of the land itself. One afternoon, Claire sat near the fence with her sketchbook, drawing the barn and the rolling hills behind it. The sun was hot, and her hair stuck to her neck. She was concentrating on the outline of the barn roof when she heard footsteps behind her. "Mind if I see?" Ethan asked Dot. She turned, startled, then smiled. "It's not finished." He leaned on the fence beside her, studying the sketch. "You see things differently," he said after a moment. "I've lived here my whole life and never noticed how the light bends on that roof." She laughed softly. "That's what happens when you stop looking. You forget beauty's right in front of you." He nodded. "Maybe that's true about more than roofs." Their eyes met for a second longer than either intended. She looked away first, pretending to adjust her pencil. Her heart thudded, and she hated that he could make her feel nervous with just a few quiet words. That evening, after dinner with the Harrisons, she walked out to the porch. The air smelled faintly of rain, though the sky was still clear. Ethan was there again, leading a cow back to the barn. He stopped when he saw her and smiled. "This one's Daisy," he said, patting the animal's neck. "Sweetest cow we've got," Claire laughed. "You name them." "Of course," he said. "They're family." He filled a metal pail with fresh milk and handed her a glass bottle. "Try this. Daisy's milk is the best." She took a sip. It was creamy and rich, smoother than anything she'd ever had. "You're right," she said. "This is better than store milk," he chuckled. "Told you. Out here, everything tastes a little more real." They stood there quietly, the air between them filled with the hum of crickets and the faint sound of the river beyond the fields. Claire didn't know why she couldn't look away from him. He wasn't flashy or talkative, but there was something about his presence, something grounded. Like the world stopped rushing when he was near. "Why do you stay here?" she asked finally. "You seem like someone who could go anywhere." He smiled faintly, but there was sadness in it. "I used to think that," he said, "but after my dad got sick, I stayed. The farm needed hands. Then I guess time just kept going." There was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. He looked out toward the hills. "Sometimes, but I've learned that not every dream needs to be loud to mean something." She felt that in her chest. Claire had built her whole life on noise career, deadlines, expectations. She wondered what it would feel like to live this kind of quiet truth. The next morning, she found him repairing a tractor near the barn. Without thinking, she brought him coffee. "You look like you could use this," she said, holding out the cup. He smiled. "You're an angel," he said, taking it. "Thank you," she laughed. "Don't get used to it." "I wouldn't dare," he said, teasing gently. It became a routine after that. Small moments that grew into something unspoken, sharing breakfast at the porch, walking by the river, feeding the animals together in the evenings. They didn't need many words. The silence between them said enough. One afternoon, Claire asked him if he ever painted. He shook his head. "No, but I like watching you do it. You look peaceful when you paint." She smiled, surprised. "You watch me?" "Only when I'm fixing the fence," he said quickly, a hint of embarrassment in his tone. "You make the place look beautiful. That's all." Claire felt warmth rise to her cheeks. She turned back to her canvas, pretending to adjust her colors. But her heart wouldn't stop racing. That night it rained for the first time since she'd arrived. The air smelled of wet soil and grass. She stood by the window, watching the water run down the glass. Lightning flashed across the sky, and for a moment she felt small but safe. Then she heard a knock at her door. It was Ethan, soaked from head to toe, holding a lantern. "Power's out," he said. "Just making sure you're okay." "I'm fine," she said, smiling at his dripping hair. "You're the one who looks miserable." He laughed. "Part of the job." He set the lantern on the table, its soft light filling the small cottage. For a moment, the world outside disappeared. It was just them, standing close enough for her to hear his breath, the warmth of him chasing away the chill in the air. "Don't worry," he said quietly, his voice deep and steady. "Storms pass." She nodded, holding his gaze longer than she meant to. And in that moment, she realized the storm outside wasn't the only one she was facing. When the rain eased, he left with a smile and a soft good night. Claire stood by the door long after he was gone, her heart strangely full. The quiet that once felt heavy now felt alive. Something had changed. Not just in the air, but inside her. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew one thing for certain. Anything wasn't just part of the farm anymore. He was part of her story, and she wasn't ready for it to end by mid-July. The farm had become more than a retreat, for Claire it had become her rhythm, her second heartbeat. Days started early, with sunlight spilling over the fields and the soft sounds of the animals waking. She had fallen into the pattern of the Harrisons' simple life. And she found herself smiling more easily, laughing without effort. But it wasn't just the peace of the countryside that made her feel alive again. Was Ethan. Their connection had grown naturally, like roots beneath the soil. Some days they barely talked. Other days they shared stories that lasted until the stars came out. Claire painted near the barn while Ethan worked nearby, fixing something, always with that quiet focus that fascinated her. He wasn't trying to be charming, yet everything about him was his calm, his patience, the way he treated the world with quiet respect. One warm afternoon, they walked to the edge of the farm where the land dipped toward a stream. The water was clear, cool, and full of sunlight. She took off her shoes, rolled her jeans, and stepped in. "This feels perfect," she said, laughing as the water splashed her ankles. Ethan joined her, his boots sinking in the mud. "You're brave," he said, smiling. "It's just water." "Yeah," he replied, "but most people don't stop long enough to enjoy it." She looked at him, realizing how true that was. For years, she'd rushed through everything, work, love, even happiness, always afraid of falling behind. But here, time felt like something she could finally breathe in. As the days passed, she painted more. Her canvas began to fill with colors that felt like emotion, gold, green, and soft gray skies. Ethan started helping her gather wildflowers for pigments, pretending not to care but always noticing the smallest details. You missed a spot of yellow, he'd tease, and she'd laugh, throwing a brush of color his way. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch, sometimes talking, sometimes just watching the sunset. He'd tell her about his father, how the farm had once been bigger, and how he had turned down a college scholarship to stay and take care of him. His father had passed 3 years ago, and since then, Ethan had stayed out of habitor. Maybe fear of what leaving would mean. "You ever think about going back?" she asked one night. He hesitated. "I used to," he said quietly. "But it's hard to imagine who I'd be out there. The world moves too fast now." Claire smiled faintly. "It does. I used to love that rush. Now I just want to be still." He turned toward her. "Then maybe you're exactly where you're meant to be." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat it felt like the air between them held something unspoken. Claire looked away first, but her heart didn't calm down for a long time after. The next morning, she helped Mrs. Harrison make breakfast in the farmhouse kitchen. The older woman watched her closely, smiling knowingly. "You've changed since you got here," she said. "Your eyes aren't tired anymore." Claire blushed. "I guess this place has that effect." Mrs. Harrison poured coffee, her tone light. "Or maybe someone here does." Claire didn't answer, but she didn't deny it either. Later that week, the sky darkened with the promise of rain. Ethan was out by the fields, working to cover the feed. Claire ran to help him, the wind tugging at her hair. Together they pulled tarps over the stacks, their laughter echoing through the open space. When the first drops fell, Ethan grabbed her hand. "Come on," he shouted, leading her toward the barn. They made it just in time. Rain came down hard, drumming on the roof. They stood there, soaked and breathless, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. She could see droplets running down his face, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked at her, eyes bright with something unguarded. "You always run toward the storm?" she asked, trying to steady her voice. "Only when I'm not afraid of getting caught," he said softly. For a moment, neither spoke. The space between them felt charged, alive. Claire wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, but something inside her stopped her. Not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't ready for what it might mean. The storm passed quickly, leaving behind a washed-clean sky. They stood in the barn doorway, watching the light return. Ethan smiled, a small, honest smile. "See, storms pass," he said. She remembered those same words from the night of the lantern and smiled back. "Yeah, they do. But sometimes storms return when you least expect them." A few days later, Claire noticed Ethan seemed distant. He worked longer hours, avoided her gaze, spoke less. When she asked if something was wrong, he just said, "Nothing. Just tired." But she could feel something was different that evening. She found him sitting on the back steps of the barn staring at the sunset. She joined him, silent at first. Then he spoke without looking at her. "I got a letter," he said. "From a university in New York. They offered me a place in their agriculture program. Full scholarship." She blinked, unsure what to say. "That's amazing, Ethan." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I applied years ago, before my dad got sick. I never thought they'd remember me." "That's good news," she said, forcing a smile. "It is," he said, his voice low. "But it means leaving. The farm, the Harrisons, this life." She didn't say anything for a long time. The words sat heavy in her chest. She should have been happy for him. This was his chance to start over. But the thought of him gone, of mornings without his quiet voice, of the barn without his laugh, it hurt in ways she hadn't expected. "When do you have to decide?" she asked quietly. "End of the month." She nodded, staring at her hands. "And what do you want?" He finally looked at her. "That's the problem," he said. "I don't know anymore." For the next few days, Claire couldn't paint. Every brushstroke felt heavy. She went on walks alone, trying to make sense of the ache growing inside her. She had come here to heal, not to fall for someone who might leave. But love doesn't wait for timing. It just happens. One evening, she stood by the pasture, watching the sky turn gold. Ethan walked up beside her, silent for a while. Then he said softly, "You've made this place feel different." Lighter. She turned toward him, eyes shining. "You've made me feel different." It was the closest either of them had come to saying what they both already knew. But sometimes love comes in seasons. That summer had given them something beautiful, but summer never stays forever. The next morning, the Harrisons' kitchen felt quieter. Ethan was already gone to the fields. Mrs. Harrison poured her a glass of milk and said, "He told us about the scholarship. We'll miss him, but it's time." Claire nodded, though her heart felt heavy. She took a sip of the milk. It still tasted sweet, but now there was something else beneath it, a quiet sadness. Like the end of a song she didn't want to stop. She went back to her cottage and stood by the window, watching the fields sway in the breeze. For the first time since arriving, she didn't feel like she was healing. She felt like she was losing something she hadn't even had the chance to hold. Still, somewhere deep inside, she knew Ethan was right. Storms pass. And sometimes they leave behind a clearer sky. What she didn't know yet was that before he left, he still had one more gift to give her, a goodbye she would never forget. The last week of August arrived quietly. The air turned cooler, and the light in Vermont began to change golden, slower, softer. The hills that once glowed green were starting to hint at autumn. Claire felt the shift in her bones. Every sound, every sunrise. Every glass of milk in the morning seemed to whisper one truth: her time here was almost over. And so was the summer that had changed everything. Ethan was leaving. The day had been set. He would drive to New York at the end of the week to start his new chapter, the one he had once thought impossible. She told herself she was happy for him, and she was, but beneath that, her heart ached quietly. The farm without him already felt emptier. Claire spent more time painting than ever. She wanted to capture everything: the way the light fell on the barn, the curve of the hills, the glow of the sky at dusk. Each brushstroke felt like a goodbye. Mrs. Harrison often brought her fresh milk, smiling gently, but even she could sense something different. The unspoken truth hung between them like a secret no one wanted to name. One afternoon, Claire found Ethan fixing a fence near the north pasture. The air smelled of hay and summer's last breath. She stood for a moment, watching him work, memorizing the way he moved. Focused, calm, quietly strong. Finally, she said, "You're really going." He looked up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Yeah," he said softly. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" She nodded. "Strange? Yes. Right? Maybe? But strange." He smiled faintly. "You sound like you don't want me to go." Claire hesitated. The words she wanted to say stayed tangled in her chest. "I want you to do what's right for you," she said finally. "That's what people who care do." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "And what about what's right for you?" She forced a smile. "I'll figure it out. I always do." They stood there, neither moving, the wind rustling through the grass. Something about the moment felt final. She wanted to say everything she felt, but the timing wasn't kind. Sometimes love shows up when life is already pulling you in another direction. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat on the porch with her sketchbook, watching the stars. Every now and then, she thought she heard footsteps near the barn, the soft hum of a man humming to himself. The farm felt alive, like it knew change was coming. The next morning, Mrs. Harrison handed Claire a small box before breakfast. "He left this for you," she said. "Said it was for when you're ready." Claire took the box, her hands trembling. Inside was a tiny wooden charm, carved carefully in the shape of a cow. On the back were two small words burned into the wood. "Be still." She closed her eyes, holding the charm tight in her palm. Later that afternoon, Ethan came to the cottage to say goodbye. He stood in the doorway, the sunlight falling behind him, turning everything golden. "I didn't want to leave without seeing you," he said. "I was going to come find you," she said softly. He smiled. "Guess we saved each other the trip." They stood there in the quiet, the weight of all they hadn't said pressing between them. Finally he spoke. "I wanted to thank you for being here, for reminding me that life isn't just about staying still, it's about being brave enough to move." Claire shook her head, her eyes glistening. "You gave me more than you know, Ethan. You taught me how to breathe again." For a long moment, they didn't speak. Then he reached into the back of his truck and brought out a small glass bottle. "Mrs. Harrison said to give you this, fresh from Daisy this morning." She laughed softly through her tears. "Of course she did. Keep it," he said. "Whenever you drink it, remember this place. Remember, you found peace once and you can find it again." He hesitated as if he wanted to say something more. But instead he stepped closer, gently brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. The touch was light, fleeting, yet full of meaning. "Goodbye, Claire." "Goodbye," she whispered. He turned, got into his truck, and drove down the long dirt road. She stood there until the sound of the engine disappeared. The hills were quiet again, only the wind moving through the grass. She pressed the little wooden cow to her heart and whispered, "Be still." The next few days passed slowly. The farm continued as always, cows to feed, fences to mend, milk to bottled butt for Claire. Everything felt different. She finished her last painting on her final morning there. It showed the farmhouse bathed in sunset light, the barn in the distance, and a single figure walking toward the hills. She titled it "The Summer That Stayed." Mrs. Harrison helped her pack. "You've got that look," she said kindly. "The one people have when they've loved something enough to let it go." Claire smiled sadly. Maybe that's the only real kind of love. Before she left, Mrs. Harrison handed her one last bottle of milk. "For the road," she said. "You'll miss it more than you think." Claire laughed. "I already do." She drove away with the bottle beside her on the seat, the road stretching out before her like a story still being written. The trees passed by in waves of green and gold, and she thought about all the moments that had changed her: the first morning silence, the laughter in the rain, the way Ethan had looked at her like he saw something she didn't even see in herself, when she stopped at a small lookout near the edge of the valley. She got out, opened the bottle, and took a slow sip. The taste was the same rich, real, filled with memory. It wasn't just milk anymore. It was the taste of a time when she had been brave enough to start over, to feel again. to let love touch her even if it couldn't stay. Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled. "The best vacation of my life," she whispered. Years later, Claire often told people about that summer in Vermont. Not the heartbreak, not even the love story, but the peace. She'd moved back to the city, opened a small art studio, and started teaching others to paint what they felt rather than what they saw. On her desk sat the little wooden cow charm and, beside it, an empty glass milk bottle every once in a while. She'd look at them and remember the fields, the rain, the laughter, and the man with the tired eyes who had taught her the quiet strength of stillness. One evening, after class, she stood by the window watching the sunset reflect off the city buildings. The sky glowed the same soft gold she remembered from Maple Hill. She smiled to herself and whispered the words that had once been carved into her heart. "Be still." And though years had passed, in that quiet moment, she could almost taste the milk again, fresh, sweet, and alive with memory. Because some things don't fade. Some summers stay with you forever. And no matter where she went, part of her would always belong to that little farm, to the gentle hills, and to the man who once handed her a bottle of milk and said, "Out here, everything tastes a little more real." That was the truth she carried with her always. The milk, the memories, and the peace that came after the storm. And every time she thought of it, her heart whispered once more, "That was the best vacation of my life."